Donald Trump caused the COVID outbreak in New York. And in mid-March, the federal government does a travel ban from Europe. Mid-March, too little, too late, Mr. President. He caused the COVID outbreak in New York.
Just the latest example of the feud between Andrew Cuomo and Donald Trump. Now, just last week, the New York governor had this to say to his fellow Queens native.
From the point of view of New York City, this has been the worst president in history. I think it's because he is from New York City, and New York City rejected him, always. He was dismissed as a clown in New York City.
He better have an army if he thinks he's going to walk down the street in New York. He can't have enough bodyguards to walk through New York City.
Of course, this president responds, usually on Twitter, every time the governor goes after him. His latest tweet calling Cuomo one of the worst governors in the USA and blaming him for the nursing home deaths. And I'm sure the president gets even madder when he sees the governor's rising poll numbers. Latest numbers show that more than 7 in 10 New Yorkers approve of the job that Cuomo is doing vis-a-vis his handling of COVID. Now, the president's numbers way under in that respect. I want to bring in our next guest who follows Cuomo every day, Justin McKinley, Albany bureau chief at the New York Times. And like you, Jesse, obviously, I was taken aback by some of the audio recordings in the Woodward book, but in many ways, it's the dichotomy of how Cuomo has chosen to handle it with those daily briefings, laying out the often really brutal and difficult numbers and the trend lines, particularly in the spring in New York. They're kind of an opposite case study, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think this does date back to the earliest days of the coronavirus, where you had Governor Cuomo doing a lot of press conferences, as you point out, and his poll numbers going up, and people reacting to kind of his very blunt, very straightforward, very fact-driven approach, whereas the president had kind of a more combative approach with the press. He, obviously downplayed the danger of coronavirus in the beginning. And I think people rejected that to an extent, particularly New Yorkers who were really seeing kind of firsthand the danger of the disease, the toll of the disease, and what have you. Since then, that relationship, which has, dates back decades, these two guys have known each other since the 90s, if not before, that relationship really seems to have deteriorated as New York has gotten better, as New York has needed the feds less for things like temporary hospitals or the hospital ship they sent up. The relationship between Cuomo and Trump has really gotten rocky, and I think in large part it has to do with federal funding and the lack thereof. The fact that the New York State is in a giant hole in terms of its budget. Cuomo keeps asking the feds for help, and as of yet, that help has not been forthcoming.
And I want to talk about that in a second, but on COVID and particularly New York's handling, listen, nobody got it perfect, but Governor Baker in Massachusetts, for example, owned some of it and said that major missteps were made in nursing home deaths in that state. And you're every day with the governor when he does these briefings, and I know you've pressed him on it, but there still is resistance to acknowledge any missteps, not just on nursing home deaths, but even in the earlier portion of the state's handling of COVID. Are you a little surprised, with the benefit of hindsight, there's not acknowledgement that they should have done anything differently?
Well, the short answer is no. I mean, anyone who's covered Governor Cuomo for a while knows that he is very, very reluctant to ever admit fault. I think in the 8 or 9 years I've been on him, I've heard him say, I made a mistake maybe once or twice. It's not really in his vocabulary. I think to a large extent that's a political calculation. There's an old saying that if you apologize and there's tape of it, that then your political opponents can say, aha, you got something wrong. And I think with coronavirus, it's gone even further than that he really doesn't think that he made mistakes. I think that even in the case of the nursing homes, where there were more than 6,000 deaths, and some of the policies, the March 25th memo about sending positive patients back into nursing homes, which has been controversial and has been kind of used as cudgel by a lot of Republicans against Governor Cuomo. I think even with that, he says, look, I was following CDC guidelines. look, it was the nursing home workers' fault. Look, it wasn't my fault. Look, other states were doing it. There has almost never been a recognition that he does have any blame in this. And I think you would, if you tried to hold your breath until he did take responsibility for it, you would end up blue in the face.
I've spoken to a few Democratic senators, and I'm getting competing views as to whether they think that after all the posturing, the state aid really will be coming and in what degree. How bad does the governor and his economic folks believe this is going to be for New York? And how draconian may some of the cuts have to be across the board if the aid does not come in remotely to the numbers they're hoping?
As you well know, financial tricks abound. There always seems to be pots of money. And when you talk to people that actually know the nuts and bolts of New York City and New York State's finances, New York State more importantly, there are reserves, there are rainy day funds, there are places where they can find money, divert money, things like that. But that being said, it is a big hole, and it is not just this year that they're worried about. It's the out years as well. Already, the governor has instituted a number of kind of smaller cuts. He's been kind of dialing back spending on things like schools and other social services in order to try to kind of lessen the blow if, in fact, the feds don't come through with any money. In talking to sources I have in Washington, it does not look like the Mitch McConnell Senate is going to come to the rescue. I don't see a scenario whereby the Senate, a Republican-led Senate, is going to come to the rescue. Now, keep in mind, there's an election coming in November. There could potentially be a Democratic president in January, maybe even a Democratic Congress. That would obviously be an easier sell for Cuomo, but the clock she ticks. We're moving to a place where cuts are going to start to hurt, where school districts and localities are really going to have to make some hard choices.
Jesse, I know the public line from the governor and even Mayor de Blasio that, listen, it's the Post or it's the president are trying to hype the city going back to the bad old days, people not only leaving in droves, but also companies that won't be coming back. Okay, even factoring some of the hyperbole, the optics are some of the optics. How concerned behind the scenes is the governor's handlers that the city is not going to look the same here for the near future, maybe even a little longer?
I don't even think it's behind the scenes. I mean, he's been very public about this. He said this week that it's not just the financials. It is the optics, as you point out. It is a rise in violent crime. Although, of course, this is nothing compared to kind of the really bad old days of the late '80s and early '90s. But still, there has been a spike in violent crime. The homeless problem has been exacerbated by the coronavirus crisis. There have been reports of people leaving the city. The restaurants are only just getting a sign of life at the end of the month that they'll be able to reopen. The kind of vibrant New York City that most people have been very accustomed to for the last 2 decades, 3 decades, is really a changed place right now. The two factors, the people living there not having a very good time and it not being a very appealing place for overseas visitors to come to, that contributes to a general malaise, I think, in the city that the governor is concerned about, and certainly Bill de Blasio is too.
Jesse, I appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Anytime.
Up next, scores of homes and countless acres destroyed as wildfires continue to spread in more than a dozen states. The very latest after the break.